First, I want to welcome all my watercolor wizards and gouache geeks and inklings to this class. My name is Hajra. I'm an author illustrator, former university lecturer. So today's focus is going to be on an Alphonse Mucha master's study. Today we're going to be working with a limited palette, also recapping and learning about Grisaille value underpainting, and also doing a master's study. So in fact, we get 3 birds with 1 stone. So Grisaille basically means the gray. Now you're going to be working in pencil, you know, when you start out drawing, and that kind of is a natural way to automatically step into doing a gray value underpainting. Color is beautiful, it's emotive, it brings so much to a painting, but it also isn't what's actually making it realistic or effective. That's what the values are doing, okay? The values bring the most punch when it comes to realism and also organization and effectiveness. The colors can actually add a lot of confusion if you don't use them in a limited way, and also if your values are not working properly. Now, old masters use this technique a lot. They used it in oil painting primarily, but you can really use it for any glazing techniques. Grisaille is basically an advanced glazing method, so you should probably stick to using it with mediums that are glazing friendly, and that would include watercolor, ink, acrylic, Inktense, and oil. It's going to be Payne's Gray, Yellow Ochre, and also I'm going to be using a transparent brown. It's actually the same color as I used in the Nightingale piece. Here's that Nightingale piece that I also did earlier this week. And as a result of that, you can kind of see the color scheme that we're working with. The tribute piece, this is part of her data graphic that she did about the number of deaths in the Crimean War. So I've got that Payne's Gray there now. And again, it's standing in as a low chroma blue, okay? So it's basically a gray Grisaille, but with a blue bias to it. Let's come in here and add the streaks, and of course you can add more water if it's going down darker. So I'm going to just put in a few streaks wet and wet like that, and then actually dilute it further as needed. You can also dilute the paint in your palette, but I found that if you dilute your paint on your palette too much, it takes too long for it to sort of dry out and get thick enough for you to use for other applications, so I prefer to just add water with the other brush on here. Spread it out a bit with the other brush. And I'm letting it bleed into that smoke and the steam and such, so it gives you that beautiful granulation to do that too, you know, versus constantly having hard edges. Damp brush to add water, and you can be more than damp if you need to dilute your paint, because I am definitely diluting it as well. And if you see any hard edges around the steam, then just go ahead and add more water. This is Cold Press Arches watercolor paper, 140 pound, and it is the back side with slightly less texture. Last time we used Fabriano hot press watercolor paper, 140 pound. So for gouache, it works well because it gives you smooth finishes to use the hot press. And I like hot press even for pieces like this. But like I said, I own a lot of cold press, and it is a great forgiving paper in comparison to the hot press. The hot press is more of an acquired taste, and it's more advanced in how it works. Arches really is my favorite paper. You can use Fabriano. I found Fabriano to be a bit too unforgiving as far as lifting. So even if it's not a mistake, even if you're just going back in to deliberately lift highlights, it's very difficult to do that on Fabriano. I'm trying to see if I want to darken up, because of course the more dark you have against this steam, the more it'll stand out. Let's ease in difficulty, and let's do the dress first because it's abstract, and finish doing the dress. And then once we're done with that, we can do the face and arms. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of that water down. Not too much, I just barely made the paper damp. And now I'm going to come back in and see where I have the gray. And I'm also going to lighten it and just tap it with my damp brush, and that's going to give me less saturation in the color there. And I can see a little bit of a shadow right here along this line, and also down this line. If I can teach you guys how to do the values underneath and then come over with the colors on top and sort of understand and get some comfort with that. And I'm going to go down from the top of the sleeve right there and just make a nice straight line. And don't make your paint too watery, make it less watery than you would use for an abstract bleed. It needs to hold the line. If you don't know if it's going to hold the line, then go over to your color wheel page or swatch card and draw a line. If it doesn't hold a line, then you need to make your paint thicker, okay? So I'm holding that line right there and coming down over to the elbow area. And now with my damp brush, it's going to save me time to do it here versus go and rinsing out the other brush and getting water in it. By the time I came back, it would probably be hard set. So now, because I had that damp brush on hand, I can just do that like this. Okay, and I stopped at her sash because her sash kind of has a different shadow there. And this is coming out in kind of a triangle shape. Okay, it comes out and sort of fans out to this degree, and there's a little bit of the dress design showing up. and I can just sort of scribble that in. I'm just doing a few scribbles. Remember, your paper shouldn't be so wet that you can't do those scribbles, and if it is, then just skip the scribbles for right now and come back in and put in a few squiggly lines. Alright, so I'm going to put a little bit of that down here, just a little scribble, and a little scribble over here, and I'm going to again take my damp brush and turn it into the shape I want. I want it to just be a little teeny triangle. Don't want it to be, whether you're painting this large or small, don't do this wet and wet, okay? You're not going to get those little triangle edges if you do it wet and wet. You'll get this bloomy, soft edge, just like we did in the background. And while it's okay for some parts of it, for the most part, you can see that these are actually gradients. Now you can see why these gloves are super helpful to me, because I have an area that's damp right underneath my glove right now. But because I have the glove on, the glove will absorb that extra water, and it's not going to end up picking up on the back of my hand, on the side of my hand, and then tracking across the rest of the paper as Payne's Gray paint. And again, I'm going to lighten those shapes up because those shapes are actually now darker than I'd like. But I just lighten them up with a damp brush. Now this brush is not dipped into water, because if I did, it would just add way too much water back to the page. So it's just damp. It's just barely damp. Kind of like a blender. You can kind of use it for a while before it gets dirty. You know, like when you're blending with a tortillon or with a blender marker, you know how you can keep blending with it for a little bit until the tip gets dirty? Well, it's the same thing with this. I kind of used my damp brush as that blender. That's a secret. And I'm just drawing that edge in. And to soften it just the teeniest bit, I am using this barely damp brush, just barely tapping it on there to make that line just slightly fuzzy. Very barely fuzzy, okay? There's so many variations between a full wet on wet and a full dry, right? There's like these places in between where you can have a fuzzy line and it not be fully wet or fully dry. And so that's kind of like a firm line versus a hard line, or a soft edge versus a lost edge. Those are the 4 types of edges: hard, firm, soft, and lost. And you can emulate that in any medium. Some mediums will do soft easier, like oil. Some mediums will do hard easier, like watercolor and gouache. Okay, I'm adding a few of those lines back in. There's a few lines and they're just kind of fuzzy. But if you do it too light, it just gets swallowed up completely, and you just end up having to do those same values all over the top again along with the colors. And then you think to yourself, why did I do this? Why did I even bother doing this? It hasn't saved me any time. Bleed over into the shoulder from the background, and I actually really like that as a soft edge, as it's sort of marrying her to the background. Remember, that's the best way to keep something from looking like a decal, is to have some lost edges along the outline. So it depends on the style. So in this case, I'm deliberately drawing Florence Nightingale and making it so that she's in hard ink, and also making all these hard edges. In this case, we're going for softer edges in some places, so we're going to have a mix of hard and soft. Like I said, it would be a good idea if you've been taking my classes to follow me on YouTube and Instagram. Those are the only 2 places where I'm going to be posting. It looks like there's kind of a lost edge. Again, observation is half the painting, so I'm not going to put that outline there. I'm going to get that even more faded off if possible. Right up to where the chain starts, I see a faded edge, so I'm going to just lose that edge. And then just along the back of, from where the chain is to her shoulder, I see a hard edge. And then also down the back of her neck here, just up to where the bottom of her chin starts, I see a line. And so I'm going to put the line right there, okay? And then when it comes to the end of that line, I'm going to fade it off with my brush like that. Starting from above her collarbone to this area, it doesn't have to be exact, just a general marker is where I see a dark line. And I also see one starting from the back there, and then there's a gap in the middle. And I'm going to soften off the edge from both sides, so it's like a lost soft edge in the center there, just like that. And then moving further down, I see a giant highlight on the chain that's about the area of her collarbone. And then further down, it's a brown, and it's a little bit of a muddier brown, so I'll add a little bit of this into it and just tap it. Don't move the brush at all. Just tap right on top of it and lift some of that color up, so it makes it a little bit lighter and slightly blurry. And now on the other side, where there is a lost edge, and again, all of this is making this chain more real, right? It looks like it's a diamond shape, like a marquee or something. So I'm going to go ahead and extend the left corner and turn it into a diamond like that, and just not paint the right side, because the right side looks like it doesn't have any shadow in it. But I'm going to blend that now, so it gives me like a half diamond, like a half of a diamond dangling there, okay? Just like that. Entire area over here is rather grayish in the final painting. It's got that greenish grayish, so I'm going to go ahead and color in that entire area to imply that. Okay, and this sleeve is round down here. In the sketch it's straight, so round it out. It's a rough sketch, so just because it's in the sketch doesn't mean it's a straight line. I'm going to go ahead and round this one off too. Also looks like it needs rounding off. And likewise, this one above it is at an angle finally because it's that sleeve fabric draping over. A lot of these fabric folds have a lot of triangles in them. Look for those triangles and angles. Don't just round everything off. I've said that before. I can see from the shading that I did here that it's not dark enough, so I'm going to come back in and add a bit more paint and then soften it out. Her dress actually ends right here. The rest of it is the brown chair, which is why you see so much brown back there. I love these Empire waist dresses and make that a wet and wet part of that chair. So just to the left, shading down towards the lap bleed, and it's not uniformly dark. It's just like the background. There's a little bit of patchiness in different places, and that's because there's the chair there, and so we're going to put the brown in there. We don't want to make it 100% dark, and put that in like right here, okay? So that's where I feel like the bottom of that chair is. And then again, put a little bit of shading underneath the elbow there. The bottom of the chair there. Again, it's kind of shady and lost, so you don't want it doesn't have to be a hard edge. In fact, it should not be a hard edge. And then come down the arm on this side, following that line. And there's a little bit more sort of softer shading, sort of playing off of the cast shadow from her arm onto the dress, just like that. Random is better, but try to make sure you leave a few gaps. If you let this paint set by letting it dry completely, your paper should be 100% dry. It should feel warm and dry to the touch, not cool. Cool means it still has some water in it. And then you come back over the top with your colors. If you don't do that, then you actually will still disperse the color underneath a little bit. It might be staining and not move too much, but it'll still move a little bit. And so in order to prevent that, you really want to make sure your colors are sort of like baked in by being dry. So even if they're staining, you want to make sure your paper is fully dry. So if you don't have the patience for that, then Grisaille or a glazing technique is not going to be at 100% effective for you. You're going to have to sort of try to figure out how to develop that patience, okay? Again, giving a few broken line indications for that. That's part of what Grisaille helps you do. For difficult pieces, it's a great help. The values usually are married to the drafting, right? Because what you're doing when you're doing your values is rendering the form, you know, figuring out where you're sculpting it with those lights and dark. And so you do that first, and then you're all done with the hardest part. And then the colors are the more sort of fun part that come over later. Okay, so I've gone ahead and done some of these shapes in here, and little triangles and circles, and some of them are following his, and some of them are slightly random. I'm also going to soften in some of them randomly, and just by tapping that damp brush on it. And again, it's the appearance, the suggestion of doing it exactly. It's not always doing it exactly. It's the same exact thing if you were copying some animal fur. It's the appearance of copying it exactly, not actually copying it exactly. Make sure you get that little crook in the elbow and slightly plump out to the side there, because, you know, she's a Regency lady, so she's not malnourished. Just get a long line here. And again, if there's any parts of this that I want to soften later, I can, but I don't want to ruin the flow of my line here coming down the side, so I'm just going to go put it in as one line, and then if I want to come back and soften some of this, like over here, and I can do it after I put the line down, okay? The larger this is, the easier it'll be as far as, you know, margin of error. But if it's smaller, then you'll have less distance to travel with your line. So it's a give and take. Like I've always said, there's no full pros in drawing bigger and no full cons in drawing bigger. Drawing bigger and smaller both have pros and cons. So over here, I can see some foreshortening, and it suddenly sort of veers down here, just the barest bit. It's not super obvious, but it just sort of curves down just as the chair is ending, and then comes straight down. Now I'm going to do the hands, and I'm going to try to follow my lines in the drafting, but I'm also going to think actively about where the knuckles are, okay? So think about here, a knuckle, so I'm going to try to make a little bit of an angle. Don't just flatten it out into Jabba the Hutt putty, okay? And if any line gets thicker like that one just did, then you can use your damp brush to come back around and straighten it out, just like that. Don't add too much water because otherwise it'll end up leaking in different directions. But do try to do a single unbroken line to begin with, and then we can come back and soften stuff. Usually for a line that's not so difficult as long as it's this thin. Okay, so this is getting rather tiny, and it'll be probably small on yours too, regardless of the size that you're doing it. But you just want to curve around. She's kind of got her finger foreshortened around that cup. A little bit of that flesh that happens between fingers, and the different segments of your fingers sort of curled around that top of that cup there and sort of squinched together. And same thing is happening with this part of the hand over here. You've got some more of that skin squinching like that, just sort of pinched together. Then the foreshortened thumb. And the thumb always has like this wedge shape usually, so when it's foreshortened like this, it can be exaggerated and it won't look wrong. It'll just look like you emphasize the bone structure. But if you de-emphasize it, then it'll no longer look like a thumb. It is at an odd angle, so don't be too worried if it like reads a little bit weird. As long as you can see that abstract shape and it's following my sketch and also his piece over there, then you're pretty much okay. I'm going to try to get this done while I'm still thinking of joints and hard edges and such as far as going around corners. So again, no harm in emphasizing the bone structure. De-emphasizing it makes it look like the person is a sea slug, okay? So they look like they've turned into a jellyfish and don't have any bone structure. So the flesh in the corners here, back by the top part of the hand, it usually has an apostrophe sort of dent in it where that wrinkle forms, and then it goes out, and then it sort of has those square edges. It's almost trapezoidal. It's drawn further out in my sketch, I think, but I can see that that's actually a wrinkle in the dress. So I'm going to go ahead and extend that wrinkle higher up to where I have that in the sketch. Again, always observe, because I could stop observing and say I already did that in the sketch and not pay attention, and then I would have had this knuckle and where it's bending in here at the wrong spot, okay? So just pay attention to those kinds of things. It's very important while you're doing your entire painting, just to pay attention. Now this teacup and the saucer here, it's ended up with an angle here. I don't like it. It's because that bled in from the background and it's given it an angular appearance. I can try to fix it here, and I can also try to fix it with the white paint. But basically when you have an ellipse, it shouldn't have any angles to it. So this is an ellipse and it's turned angular. And I can sort of, like I said, try to remedy it. Luckily, this exact spot is where he's used white paint over the top of it. So I can go back and make this more circular and heal that angle. Top edge of this is not going to be completely round because it's following how the skin sort of folds over. So I'm going to emphasize that rather than de-emphasizing that. And then just shade down to that so there is no cup line on that side. And then on this side, I can see that I'm going to draw on the rest of the cup. Following that same curve into the top of the teacup. A little bit darker tea on one side. The entire tea is actually kind of shaded so that it's not a bright yellow. So I'm going to put darker outlines where it's darker on the two left and right sides, and then shade into the center. And now I can see some texture on the side. I don't know if it was design that he was implying on here or just reflection, but I'm just going to emulate that, whether it's a design or a shadow reflection. Looks like she's lit by firelight is my assumption. Looks like she's got like this directed light coming from the right bottom. You know, maybe this is a rougher porcelain cup of some sort, or maybe it's got some kind of textured spottage in it, or maybe this is the design that's being reflected. Either way, I'm just going to emulate that area here where I see it's curving, firelight or whatever around her arm there, and curving backward. And again, I've got a soft edge there, and I'm only putting in a very sheer amount of this. And it fades to a lighter color going towards the back, so I'm going to fade that off. So this is all rather dark right now for what I feel like it should be here. So I'm going to go ahead and dilute this with the damp brush. So we're doing the gray value underpainting the entire time, so that as a result of that, we're going to be working in the gray color we chose until we are ready to do the colors over the top. And you want to divide the values completely from the colors. And that means we're going to do the gray first. And again, it helps you find this form accurately. So do not put that much gray in it. It's just a slight indication of where I'm going to put some of my brown shadow. And I think when it comes to the upper arm, there's a little bit, just the teeniest bit that does that right there. Again, it's kind of like showing the separation between the upper arm and the lower arm as it bends. Over here, this finger, the last bend, to make it recede, you want to put that pop of color again. Again, this is something Mucha does a lot, and I have done it in my own pieces, is that you take that folding last bit of knuckle and move it further behind in the actual plane of things by making it darker. Okay, so then it sort of recedes as it gets further away. I think it's darker and cooler as it heads further back, right? It seems like there's a shadow. Drag that out. And you can soften off that edge coming around the corner a bit, but not too much, you might lose the highlight. See a little bit of shading right underneath here. So I'm just gonna put that underneath that part of the palm where it's sort of getting that skin folded together. And I see a slight amount right here. The little dimple that you get when your knuckle sort of folds back into that area, it's sitting right there. A single line for that cleavage there, tiny bit showing there, and then shade towards the right, not towards the left, towards the right, because we are seeing the crest and turn of this breast. We're not seeing that one. The other one's sitting at this angle. Come down on that side, but I want it to bleed down just a bit, just like that. And I'm gonna go ahead and play with the end of that shape and not leave it entirely like that, but I do want it to bleed down because you might see his shadow shape bleeds down a bit too. I'm just poking, so instead of swiping, I'm poking. This is the swipe stroke, this is the poking stroke. Okay, so I'm poking. Let's start with the ear. We've kind of got this seashell shape. Okay, so there's just a little bit of a V down here, okay? And there's a little bit of a curve up there, and that's pretty much it. That's all that's implied of that ear. Everything else is kind of swallowed up underneath that tendril of hair that's coming across. When you're doing this at home, pay attention to how it curves out, and then when it gets to the bottom of the eye socket area, it goes in like that, and then it comes back out. And that's more or less depending on a person's individual bone structure. But the curve of the cheek, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in, drawing the chin in, and the line under the chin, just like that, to right there, and we're going to fade that out. And then this bottom line is where the crease in her neck is from where the skin is folding as she's bending her head down. So we're going to soften that bottom line out more and quite significantly. And then the top one, we're going to actually blend that out a bit more too. Just wants it to be fuzzy, but still there. I can see that it comes down the bridge. And I've got that plane of the nose, that's the side plane, and then the bottom plane where the nostril is curving in, okay? Okay, I'm also going to get that left part right there. There's a teeny little line to indicate the turning point of the nostril on the other side. And then onto this side, you've got a nostril, and again, it's going to be in this paisley shape, okay? A teeny tiny paisley shape is going to be easier for you, I presume, because God knows you're probably not drawing this as small as I am. But that's why we have it zoomed in so you can see it like it's giant. And indicate even that little turn in the nose right there. And again, I've kept it more angular so you can see the planes of the nose. Think about it before you touch your brush to the paper, you know? It's kind of like when they say when you sew, measure twice and cut once, right? Curve is up. Darker shading in the center there, fading out towards the bow. This is all very clear if you took the features class, and if it's not, then just follow along. You know, a little bit of a hint of that bow on that side going up, okay? Because remember what I said, you don't have to draw in everything that you know is existing here. You just want to imply most of it, okay? Because in a painting, just like in real life, you don't have those hard edges. So some of it is dark and some of it is light, some of it fades, and some of it is there at that angle. But if you can't be exact at smaller sizes, then don't paint at a small size, just paint slightly larger than I am. I can see that there's wells here, like, you know, the eye sockets, but I'm going to fade those lines a bit. And then there's a shadow area under the chin right here. So I'm just going to indicate that shadow area just like that, and then I'm going to soften it off. There's actually more shading here, but like we said, we're going to come back to this bottom part of the face once we're done with the eyes too. Now, the eyes are, again, an exercise in softness, and they are the focal point of any portrait, so a lot of pressure here. Again, here's the DMV appointment part of this, okay? So if we can just get past this, and we can go to the county fair right after this. Just bear with me. Okay, so you can see how that curves down and follows the angle of my sketch. Make sure you do the same. And then there's only a single highlight in that eye over to the left there. I can also reclaim it with more white as needed. The important part is I get the shape right, and then I can soften and retain highlights or fix stuff later. This part is the highest part of the eye, right here. Remember we said that in the features class too? So make sure you get that part hard. And then down here is where she's got her eyelash line. And it's very barely implied. And so now I'm going to come back and soften. And I soften up towards that because it looks like she's losing a little bit of that white. And also I'm going to soften up into that corner because it also looks like she's lost some of it into that corner with the shadow. Okay, so we're going to do the lash line, just darken it up a bit. Again, turn the corner here to make it round. Okay, the eyes are round, they're not lying flat in the head. Angle it out towards that. And again, if you feel like after the class that you need to fix any of it, then fix it. Okay, if I need to fix it a little bit, then I can fix it. This is just the best we're doing with the time we have right now. You can always adjust it a little bit later. And bring this part down here. The eyebrow is soft at both ends, okay, sort of tapers like that and goes around the corner there to a softer disappearing edge as it goes away. So start out with a thin sliver, just like I have here, that's soft, and then darker in the middle and then fading off towards the right. It's looking like a pretty good likeness to what he has here. And bring the lash line just a bit lower and further out. It gives her more of that sort of country, soft, doe-eyed look. She really does have eyes that are higher on this side. The line, the slant of it is higher going to this side, okay? With any luck, you'll end up with what should be a more pleasing expression in your paint than with your pencil, because it's always going to happen when you're painting, especially if you utilize the soft edges properly. Softer and sort of sweeter and more dainty. Okay, so I've got that fold, and when I get that fold, I blend towards the bottom to soften it, okay, towards the bottom, so it softens it towards the center. And then I also come back in and put the darker on the left and the right. So I'm putting the dark on the left, and then the dark on the right. And then I'm going to come back in and soften that some more, okay? Muck about with that and try to figure out what it is that I need to change. Maybe bring this part a little bit lower. Okay, so she's got a peak of her eyebrow showing up right there. And the top of her eyebrow tapers down, so it doesn't have that square part of it. A stickler for the accuracy of where it is, but I'm just lightening it a bit because it looks like it landed a little bit higher than I wanted. And now it's okay. This part extending around the corner is a soft edge. It looks like a horrible hard edge right now, but I'm going to hopefully soften it. There we go. And it's a triangle shape, so let's try to make that into a triangle coming down here. Okay. And also pick up, if I can, probably gonna have to use the scrubber because I lost my angle on this side, and so I want to get my angle back on that side. Yeah, we're only as accurate, sadly, as how hard you try, you know? So if you don't try harder as far as the accuracy, then it's not going to happen on its own, right? This area over here has a little bit of shadow here as well. So maybe let's put the shadow in here first, because that way I can finish up this area. The rest of it fades to a brown, and then it also comes up to this part past the eye. The hair, doing that line there, and then another line up here. So but there's a muzzle shape shadow, and it also curls around her cheek. So it starts kind of under her chin right here. Again, if you have too much water, this is going to get away from you, so try not to have too much water. The bow on the other side is where it starts. So it's right here is where the shadow starts, okay, from right here, going further out. It doesn't have to be super dark. Sensitive about making it super dark because it can ruin it. It doesn't have to be the perfect value on your first go in the middle of a live stream that you're, you know, taking a class. And this comes up around the corner. And I can see that shadow blends up into that side of her face. And I'm trying to neaten this side of it because I feel like it's lost the edge there. Might just be the paper getting a bit beat up there, or it might just be that it's too wet or something. And then coming back up around here, I feel like there's a shadow that is right here to right here, and again I'm going to soften that. So you see how I put some of those down in a hard edge to find the shape and then come back around and soften it? That's a much more controlled way of shading it than coming in and just making it all wet all at once and then losing control of the top part of the lid there. I feel like it faded back more than I'd like. This is that fold that holds a little bit of water as you wake up and sort of decreases in size throughout the day, and depending on how much salt you've had, it can be more or less over the lid over there. She looks like she likes salt like I do. I'm gonna make this part just a little bit lower. I can see that there's a bit of a triangular shape to that shadow, and I see a little bit of a shadow here where that bony part of the nose is ending, and also the socket is starting. I can see that there's a soft shadow from her hair on her forehead. Okay, so I'm gonna put that in right here, and I think that's it for the shadows on the face. We're done at the DMV, we can leave. So congratulations, you've gotten through the hard part of this if you have been following along. Streak some of this in dry, just like this, and a few of these lines, more indentations. He leaves a lot of holes in the hair. You might notice this from his other pieces. Okay, and right here is a shadow spot that stops into a soft edge, so I'm going to now take that damp brush and blend that out. Hair is also a diverse mix of hard and soft edges. It's not just soft and it's not just hard. So sort of pay attention to both of those. And having a little bit of a sketchy stroke is very helpful. And it's okay for the brush to skid a little bit. As it skids, it's going to give you a little bit of that hair texture. Looks like she's wearing some kind of a little crescent in her hair. That's a little hairpin. That's cute. Didn't notice that before. You never look as closely at a painting as you will when you're painting it. That's one of the great gifts of painting something, even if you're a beginner, is that you get the opportunity to look at something very closely in a way that you wouldn't if you just looked at it and walked by. And then now coming down around the corner, be a little bit stressful if you haven't painted along the side of a face before, but trust me, once you've done enough faces, all you think to yourself is, even if I do ruin this, I can always do another one, you know? It's just, in the end, it's just a piece of paper. You're just learning. And some people learn faster, other people learn slower. Nobody starts at the same spot. But you can always get to where you want to go as long as you put in the time to practice. Now, this has sort of faded towards this area in a hard line, and I don't like it at all, so I kind of have to catch that before it's too dry into there. Payne's gray and these other colors are very staining. I think now I have the curl going up to this side through the center of the forehead. It's actually further here, and then this curl over here. So if you can just make this part curl this way instead of going that way, there we go. Then it looks less like a line, and I'm going to lift this part to make it even less like a line. Fix that. There we go. I think I can dry brush, skid in some more texture here and there. I like how it sort of loses itself in the background in a few places. I think the rest of it is pretty much okay. Alright, now that's a full finished Grisaille on this, and okay, so I'm going to put the yellow here. Just pull some brown out over here. Dab off the extra right here, and also on the other side, because that's where we're going to make, the other mixes that have a bit of yellow in them. Okay, so now we've got your little triad, a little circle of colors. 6 basic mixes from my 3 colors. And you can see that I'm putting it on wet on dry to begin with, and it's going to be rather opaque, and then I can add water as I need. So here's my water, and I'm going to dilute it, and you can see that what it's doing already is it's taking the Payne's gray and turning it into that greenish color that we were talking about, right? This greenish color, it's going to happen automatically, this color right here, because we're mixing up the yellow, and even though it's pure yellow, it's going down on top of this area that has the Payne's gray in it. So now I'm basically just gonna, to start with, because we do the highlights later with this, you know, in this piece we don't have to save highlights because he's actually come over the top. So it makes our job easier. And it's gonna give me a nice pop of greenish gray in some areas and a nice pop of bright yellow in other areas, okay? And that's pretty much locked in. It's not scooting very much. And don't scrape at the paper, but yes, it's pretty much locked in. Okay, so it's going pretty fast. And the reason I started on the bottom is because this is the oldest paint, okay? And also into this chair, I can see that there's, see how I did the Payne's gray underneath it? And then did the brown, and then now I've got that yellow, and it's just mapping it out for me, okay? And if I want to fade the yellow at all, then I can do that too. Okay, so now I'm just using that damp brush to fade it all around. You can see that in some parts of this chair where I had done the brown, there is some yellow there, so I'm going to go ahead and pop that in. Again, I can do the highlights later, and I'm going to come back in with the yellow over the top of it. Make sure you leave a wet edge or you fade it off on this side so there's no hard edge. Okay, so I'm fading it off with the damp brush. You should do the same, otherwise you'll end up with a hard edge there. And again, if I was working around those highlights like we've done in a past Mucha piece, then you just work around them and you'd be able to save them. In this case, we're just not doing that. But if you wanted to, you know, you could work around them. See, like right here, I can lift out some of this and see how it's saving some of that highlight for me, just like that. All right, so now over here, I see that there's yellow and then it fades to a brownish red. So I'm gonna go ahead and give it a coat of the yellow for the most part. And then I'm going to come back in with a little bit of that brown and drop the brown in on this side and let it mingle in a soft way. Don't let it have a hard edge, so peck at it, you know, that modeling stippling stroke that I was talking about, just model it in there. And then the sash is also a modeled in brown just like that, so you can just model that in. The T, you can make it into that ochre color, and you can do the same thing for the sides of the teacup here. You can just wet on dry, stroke in some of that ochre. Now over here I've got the ochre in for most of it. And then also I can take my other brush, I'm gonna put brown on my other brush and just have a little bit of that brown right there. So because our Grisaille was not brown, it was not a Brunet, you're gonna wanna put in any brown shadows that you see anywhere, but there's not very many. That's one of the reasons why we chose the Grisaille, is because most of the shadows are in the gray. And so I'm only gonna put in the brown a little bit as needed in some of these areas where I need a little bit more pop of that temperature, more towards the red, okay? So I've got brown on the third brush now, and I'm going to go ahead and stripe it in. Stripe it in. It looks like it's a few disparate stripes. It's not like a solid color, and it's also not soft. It's kind of like a striped and modeled in, so that's kind of what I'm doing here too, just to emulate that. Alright, so now moving on to the other part of this, the base color is again yellow. But see how we can just sort of fly through this now in comparison. So I'm going to put a little bit of the brown in just a few of these places, just to add a little bit of that color contrast. I'm going to get the yellow in as our base color. Again, white highlight sharply on that shoulder. We're going to come back and take care of that later, so I'm going to go ahead and cover it up and not be troubled by that too much. See a little bit of brown here. Right here. Just a little bit of the darker shadows, a bit warmer. So just adding a bit of warmth. And see, now I just have to work on temperature and color. I don't have to work on value nearly as much. I'm just going to go ahead and put a sheer wash of that. We're sort of using this as our replacement red, so which means that we'd be using the, you know, the pure brown here. And I'm going to take the edges here, just where they are right here, and sort of soften them off with my damp brush. It helps them, again, fade into that background a bit. And a pure swatch of this just looks like this. So you know this is different, because even though it might look like you're obliterating the shadows here, you're not. You're really not. You're really still benefiting from the shadows there. And you also could have made them darker if you wanted to have even more contrast. I think there's enough contrast here that we don't have to worry about that. I'm going to try to build a little bit of a structure in, so there's a lighter area right in the center there, just a bit. And then kind of following how we did the shadows. It does fade back as it dries, so this is watercolors. We're working transparently over in this little crescent. And just add a bit of yellow in there. And also in the front lock of her hair, I just want to have a little bit of that temperature contrast there. And get it all over the skin. And ochre is rather opaque, so you're going to work with this rather thin. You know, it's very nearly monochromatic. There's only really that yellowish brown, and the rest of it is just a gray, which doesn't even count as a chromatic color. Which is why this made a good fast study, because I knew that it wouldn't otherwise get done. And just sweep across. And remember to have a light hand, okay? Don't scour at that paper. You worked hard to get those shadows and everything in, and you don't really want to obliterate all of them. And the paint tends to stick, but it isn't waterproof. It is still watercolor. And for me, it doesn't tend to lift up most of the time because I have a light hand. Alright, so let's go ahead and do the same thing down here on the arms. And we have a very limited palette, so as a result of that, it is going to make it so she doesn't have like rosy pink cheeks, okay? Putting that over the blue here is giving, again, that shadow to the arm. It's already there on all the fingers, on everything. So this is the dress that's showing up, so I'm going to go ahead and get some opaque yellow and put it right here. That's where that dress is. It's not really going to ever go towards rosy. It's just like this mid peachish tan, okay? That's the rosiest we can really get. And so that's what we're going to be shading with, okay? So now we're going to come right over. But you've got a little bit of a map, a value map there that I can follow. So in the places that we painted so far, we didn't really use it as a map. We just sort of painted over it and let it influence the color over the top, which is very useful. But now we're using it for two things. We're using it to influence the color and also as a map. Darker color there. And it has that shape, okay? And we're not going to end up with the exact same colors as him, for good reason, because we didn't actually use the same colors as him. We used mostly the same colors. So if you wanted to get exactly the same colors, you'd probably add an orange. It's a pretty convincing skin color, because what ends up happening is color is relative. So given that this is the only color we're using, it starts to appear like skin color. Again, using that as a value map to help guide where I want more of that color. So let me get the whole hand in this area a bit darker, because I can see that it is darker. So now come back over to the finger here and the bottom knuckle. Now over here, this area of the wrist, there's a bone there. You can see it on your own wrist perhaps. Depends on how much fat you've got around it. But it can definitely be shown and defined in a piece like this, because I can see it over there. Put the same thing in for her elbow. We put it in before, we can put it in again. And with that gray underneath it influencing that, see, like again, it gives that nice, warm, cool pop, right? The warm with the brown and the cool with the gray. You wouldn't get that if you had just popped in the brown, okay? If you just popped in the brown, it would look like this. All right, so I'm going to get that top part of the hand there, and I can see this part of the wrist, and down here is darker. Okay, that back finger is darker. So we're just going to do a little bit for the cleavage. And again, shading towards the right here. Okay, so I'm shading towards the right. And it sort of fades off around that point. There's a shadow that comes in from the back right here. I know I mentioned it earlier, but just to mention it again. This is that mix between the ochre and the brown. So it's that medium color that I was showing over and over again that we mixed earlier for the skin color. So it's brown, but with the yellow in it as a bias, so it's not a pure brown. And when used carefully, then it just looks like shading on the lighter skin. Some yellow over the top of that to give it more of a skin tone look to it. Get over to the lips here. And I'm going to do the same thing following that map, as I'm going to make the lips darker at the corners and darker in this far corner, and then I'm going to blend towards the center, okay? And in this scheme, because we're using this as quote-unquote red, it will read a little bit like red, right? So that actually looks red, even though it's just brown. So I'm going to go back to that skin tone color I've got. First, you're going to go down the nose here and emphasize that plane. It reads as a flush because it's the only color we're using. If you'd have red in this piece anywhere else, that would look brown. Okay, see how I'm just blending that in and see how it's helping me, the grisaille underneath? Your brain is what's conducting the fact that color exists. in real life, we just see the world in values. There are no colors. But your brain is actually indicating that those different wavelengths have these labels that the brain is attached to it. And those labels are these color markers, but it's made up. It's all in your brain. That's why different people see colors differently, and you can even have colorblind folks and all that stuff, you know? Okay, so here goes with the brown over the top. Again, it's that same skin color. I'm using that same skin color. Okay, just the skin color and shading that about the face right over the gray. And where it's gray, it's really just going to turn into a darker shadow color, and where there is no gray, it gives me that cleaner color. Remember how exact I was when I was talking to you about being at the DMV and everything? This is not the DMV. This is the county fair, walking around with a turkey leg. Okay, this is a lot more fun than that, because there just isn't that much work here. I am, you know, using the color to indicate what I want, but all of the work I did with that shading and shaping the eye and finding the accurate shapes and everything, this is all done already, you know? This is not something I have to do now because I already did it. She has that shape that I was talking about earlier that we erased, that I said comes down the cheek a bit. It's that indication of that eye socket. It's not a bag, it's a well. You know, we have these wells, the tear wells, and some people have them more prominent even in their youth. And I think she's kind of got more of her cheek color coming down here, so let's try to give her some of that. And some of this color coming down here, which I put in before, but looks like it faded considerably. The reason this is easier is because even though it's a more tedious process than the tiling, you know, because most people want to do everything together, it separates the stages of the color and the value and everything. So as a result of that, it's actually easier because you don't have to think about color at the same time. I look at color and temperature afterward, and I look at value and shape first, okay? The lips faded back just a bit too much for me. So I'm going to go ahead and add just a bit more of that to the lips and then blend off the damp brush. I think her bow, to me, looks like it goes further on that side and sort of melts into the shadow there. So I think I'm going to just extend that. It makes her look a little bit happier. And same thing for the nose. I think I've lost a little bit of the value contrast under the nose here. I'll come back and shape that in and add in that line. Just right there. And we forgot, or I forgot, whenever something's wrong, I include everybody in it. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and put the steam in, because he has a steam in the light color here. I'm going to get some white gouache, put in a little bit of that steam right here, and I'm going to use my damp brush to pat at this. See how it's making the edge of her hair cloudy here, because it's sort of fading away. So this is that in-between that I was telling you about, where you use mostly watercolor and then you'd come in with a little bit of gouache just for the highlights. So I've got that crescent marked in now.
The magic trick is having that dampened brush handy to soften edges and lift out color, says Diane. The Hajra method.
It's definitely the Hajra method. I don't know if anybody else cares about that method at all, but for me, it's pretty much everything. Like, you know, having that blending brush there is very, very useful for me. Okay, so I'm adding a little bit of highlight here. And again, we could have saved this. So if you didn't want to add the white, you could save it. Retrieving highlights versus preserving highlights. This is additive versus subtractive painting. Okay, so let's get a few of these in. I'm just putting this in more or less randomly because, like I said, I just want to give a little bit of dimension to the color in the areas where I feel like that there's a bit more of a highlight. And just doing it like that, even just a little bit, is going to give you a third dimensional color there. Okay, and any place where you make that sharper, you know, you'll get more of a highlight, see? So any place you make it duller and softer, you'll get less of a highlight. The highlight on her eye got a little bit smaller than I'd liked. So even though they're quite dull in the painting, I like my highlights to typically be larger. Okay, so here's this part of it where, again, we're going to add in these highlights. Some of these, remember, I was lifting out over here, so it's actually quite preserved for some of this right here. For other parts, I'm putting it in, but for a lot of it, it's actually pretty well preserved just because I had left it there already. And these are not bright white. They're actually, the ones over here aren't bright white. So I'm going to kill them down a bit by blending them off. And then it sort of comes down into this area. There's like a little shape there that we seem to have lost. I'm just going to get that shape back. So see how it helps you highlight and correct those areas while at the same time giving you sort of a more opaque full-bodied look to the piece, okay? Now over here on the necklace, I think there was this part right here. We didn't put in the gold in the necklace yet, so we actually have to come back and do that anyway. But there was that highlight over there, and then there was also a highlight in the center of the bodice there. So it was a pretty good bet that that swell, where that breast is swelling there, it's going to have a highlight there, okay? And do a few more of those highlights. Through here. Just adds a bit more complexity, a bit more shine to that bodice by doing that, you know? A little bit of that in the center of that. The highlights down that side right there. This is all yellow. I don't have to fix the top of the teacup. I mean, that bright white of the paper is going to be brighter than any highlight I put down. Is going to be a brighter white than any paint that you can put down over the top. So if you want like literally the brightest highlights you can get, you'd want to use the paper. But it's not always possible as a technique. I try to do it for when I'm doing traditional watercolor pieces for that reason, because even though it's harder, the highlights are much brighter. And add just a bit of identity there for where it is actually ending. Okay, and it's this part that I actually want to round off like that. There we go. Now that looks quite round. I think it's pretty much fixed from the problem that I was having before. Ochre right here. And that all sorted out. We've got some really pretty fun highlights that are happening just in certain areas where the dress is hitting the light. I actually preserved some of them by default up here. This is again the white of the paper, and again going to be brighter than the paint. Because you can see how this paint fades a bit. You have to come back and layer it, and this is still brighter. And look at how bright that cup is, you know, in comparison. I have to come back and spruce this up a few times. You have to get it quite opaque in order for it to get close to matching the opacity and strength of the paper white. Trying to see, okay, so I've got all that white down there. Highlight right here on this chair, so just on this side. It's like it's a nicely varnished, polished to a high sheen chair there, so see how that makes that pop? And sort of a paler highlight here that I want to fade into the wood. And also higher up here, fade that into the wood. I can go ahead and sort of put a little bit more of an emphasis on them. Same thing for this side. I kind of like how it fades into the lost edge of the background there, so I don't know if I'm actually doing this piece a disservice by calling more attention to that part of it, but might as well add that in there while we're there because it's in the original piece. Also, the seams along the chair here, there's an indentation where it actually reads as lighter just for the teeniest bit. And these are all like little details that if you choose to find them, you can, you know.
Do you feel like that chair is too big?
I noticed that when I was drawing it, I was like, that's a really big chair, and it looks like it keeps going. It feels like it should stop behind her at this point, like it wouldn't be peeking out from that side. But who am I to say? I wasn't there to look at the original piece of furniture, so this might be an exact replica of what was there. And I'll add a little bit of this light yellow to this crescent real quick, because remember I painted it white, and now it looks too white. So I'm just going to add a little bit of pale yellow to it, so it's kind of like a mix between the yellow and the white. Teeniest bit of rounded here, and I could put it right there. And then blend off. I'm just trying to round off that shape. That's basically what my prerogative was. Little things like that make a big difference with the actual final part of the piece. So let me just go and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put the brown in on the other side here. And then now I'm going to follow the dark lines. So the same dark lines I had in the brown. But yeah, tiling is an advanced technique if you use it for a hard piece. I did choose a very hard piece too. I chose a very impressive line decker piece. So you can see how I put in the brown, then skipped, brown, and then skipped, brown, and then skipped to let it go into a highlight, and then brown up here, and then soften at both sides, and then skip. And then same thing for back there, brown, just the pure yellow ochre, and then come into the locket. And because it has the gray on one side and it's got the brown underneath it, it looks very complicated, right? It ends up looking like it's way more complicated. Now I'm not going to connect it right to the center. I'm going to leave it. There's still some gaps. At least lengthen them with a little bit of that yellow, okay? So I can do that. Stipple in, just for fun, some into the locket here and make it a bit more shiny. And also put some highlight in someplace else, like right here and right here. And again, I'm sort of winging it a bit. You can go ahead and put it in. I'm going to patch it into a few different places first, and then come back and soften it out as I desire. Kind of looking for where I feel like the shape isn't as natural, like to me anyway, and trying to fix that part of it. You can make it a bit, you know, swirlier if you want down here before it smokes out, because it's actually pretty in its steamy swirliness as well. It's more complicated than tiling actually as a technique, but it makes it, the stages breaks it down easier, so it's less complicated when you're doing the rendering first and then doing the colors later. You know, it has a lot of tiles, you know, this has a huge number of tiles, but just also look at the result, right? The opaque versus the transparent, and so you get different results with different mediums. This looks like oil or acrylic, and this one looks like, obviously, like watercolor, right? So you can do different techniques. The grisaille and the glazing works well with this, and then the tiling works well with this, but they will both help you learn how to do the other one better. They inform each other, so they all get better with practice. You know, you'll get better at one if you do more of the other. So it was lovely to have you guys here. Thanks so much for parking your brushes here with me, and have a great weekend, and wishing you all epic art adventures.